He thought she was just another local looking for a free drink, an easy target for his bloated ego. He laughed in her face, completely unaware that the quiet woman nursing a bourbon wasn't a fragile civilian, she was a Tier 1 operator. This is the story of a fatal misjudgment. The salty, marine layer of the Pacific Ocean clung to the streets of Coronado, California, settling over the coastal town like a damp, heavy blanket. Just a few blocks from the naval amphibious base, the absolute epicenter of the United States Navy SEAL training pipeline, sat McPee's Irish pub. To the untrained eye, it was just a local watering hole with sticky floors, dimly lit corners, and a decent selection of draft beers. But to those deeply entrenched in the naval special warfare community, it was an institution. It was the living room for the quiet professionals, the place where ghosts went to drink. On a damp Tuesday evening, the pub was relatively subdued. In a darkened corner booth, far away from the glow of the neon beer signs, sat Riley Hayes. She wore a faded, charcoal-grey hooded sweatshirt under a worn leather jacket, her dark blonde hair pulled back into a messy, utilitarian bun. She was nursing a neat pour of Maker's Mark, her posture relaxed but deeply grounded. Her hands rested on the scarred wooden table. If anyone had bothered to look closely, they would have noticed the thick, white scar tissue tracing across her knuckles, or the subtle, hyper-vigilant way her eyes tracked every single person who walked through the heavy wooden front doors. But nobody was looking closely. She was, by her own design, entirely invisible. That was until Bradley Sterling decided he needed an audience. Bradley pushed through the pub doors with the subtlety of a flashbang grenade. He was a 34-year-old defense contractor working for a private military logistics firm. Though the way he carried himself, one might assume he had single-handedly won the global war on terror. He wore the unofficial uniform of a man trying desperately to project lethal competence, khaki 5.11 tactical pants, a tight black t-shirt that stretched across his gym-built chest, and an oversized, profoundly expensive Garmin diving watch. He was flanked by two of his junior colleagues, Todd and Greg, who served as his personal echo chamber. "I'm telling you, the gear these guys are running over at Defgro is obsolete," Bradley loudly proclaimed to his friends, his voice easily cutting through the low hum of the bar. He slapped a $50 bill on the mahogany counter. "Tsh, keep the tab open. We're celebrating the new DoD contract." Riley didn't flinch, but a microscopic sigh escaped her lips. She took a slow sip of her bourbon, feeling the familiar burn slide down her throat. She had spent the last 72 hours jumping out of a C-17 at 30,000 feet, conducting high-altitude, high-opening freefalls over a classified drop zone in the Nevada desert. Her muscles ached with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. All she wanted was 45 minutes of silence before she had to report back to the command center on the Strand. Bradley, however, was scanning the room, hungry for validation. His eyes swept past the older veterans playing darts and the off-duty instructors at the bar, eventually landing on the solitary woman in the corner booth. In Bradley's aggressively narrow worldview, a woman sitting alone in a legendary Navy bar was only there for one reason: to catch the attention of a hero. And Bradley, in his own mind, fit the bill perfectly. "Watch and learn, boys," Bradley muttered to Todd and Greg, flashing a predatory grin. He grabbed his pint of IPA and sauntered over to Riley's table, sliding into the heavy wooden chair opposite her without an ounce of hesitation or an invitation. Kind of a rough place for a girl to be drinking all by her lonesome, isn't it? "Oh," Bradley asked, leaning forward, resting his thick forearms on the table. Riley slowly lowered her glass. Her expression remained completely neutral, an icy calm that had been forged in the freezing surf of the Pacific during Hell Week. "I prefer the quiet," she said simply. Her voice was steady, possessing a surprisingly low, resonant timbre. Bradley chuckled, a condescending sound that grated on the ears. "Quiet? Here? Sweetheart, this is where the real men come to unwind. You know, the guys who actually do the heavy lifting for this country. I'm Bradley, by the way. Aegis Tactical Solutions. We supply the specialized optics for the operators across the street." "Hey," waited for a reaction, a widening of the eyes, an impressed gasp, perhaps a flurry of questions about his dangerous, highly classified life. He received absolutely nothing. Riley just stared at him. The silence stretched between them, thick and incredibly uncomfortable. "That's nice," Riley finally said, her tone utterly devoid of interest. She picked up her glass again. Good night, Bradley. The dismissal was polite but absolute. It hit Bradley's fragile ego like a physical blow. The smirk on his face faltered for a fraction of a second before twisting into something much uglier and far more arrogant. He wasn't used to being brushed off, especially not when he was wearing his finest tactical gear and flashing his company card. "You're a little frosty, aren't you?" Bradley sneered, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. He raised his voice just enough to ensure his buddies at the bar could hear him. "What's the matter? You waiting for one of the frogmen to come sweeping in and buy you a drink? Hate to break it to you, but those guys are a little too busy for locals who hang around bars hoping to bag a uniform. Besides, they don't exactly go for the standoffish tomboy type." Wiley didn't blink. She didn't flush with anger or shrink into her seat. Instead, her eyes narrowed just a fraction of a millimeter. To an experienced operator, that microscopic shift in her gaze would have been a glaring red warning light, a universal signal to back away slowly. But Bradley was not an operator. He was an overpaid logistics manager who had spent too much time playing first-person shooters. "You're in my light," Riley said, her voice dropping an octave, possessing the cold, hard edge of a sharpened combat knife. "Move." Bradley let out a sharp, incredulous bark of laughter, glancing back at Todd and Greg, who chuckled obediently from the bar. He turned back to Riley, his face flushed with the alcohol and the thrill of the confrontation. He was determined to put this woman in her place. "Oh, what?" Bradley taunted, leaning aggressively over the table, invading her personal space. The smell of cheap cologne and stale beer rolled off him. "You're gonna get tough with me? Look around, sweetheart. You're entirely out of your depth. You think just because you put on a scowling face and drink whiskey you can hang with the big dogs? Women like you come into Coronado all the time, playing tough, trying to act like you belong in a warrior's world. It's pathetic." As Bradley continued his monologue, Riley's right hand shifted smoothly, pulling a heavy unmarked brass challenge coin from her jacket pocket. She set it on the scarred wood of the table. It landed with a heavy, authoritative thud. It wasn't shiny or new. The edges were deeply worn, the metal darkened by sweat, sand, and time. Bradley's eyes dropped to the coin. He smirked, shaking his head. "Oh, look at that! Did your boyfriend give you a little souvenir? A challenge coin? That's cute. You know my company mints those for the supply battalions. Tell me, what base did you buy that at? The gift shop on the Strand?" Without asking for permission, Bradley reached out his thick fingers to grab the heavy brass coin. Faster than the human eye could comfortably track, Riley's hand shot out. Her scarred fingers clamped down on Bradley's wrist like a steel vice. The movement was so abrupt, so shockingly violent in its suddenness that Bradley practically choked on his own breath. He tried to yank his arm back, but her grip was completely immovable. It felt as though his wrist had been bolted to the table. He looked into her eyes and saw something terrifying, a complete and total absence of fear, replaced by a terrifying, predatory calm. "Shh, do not touch that," Riley whispered. The volume of her voice was remarkably low, yet it carried an unmistakable promise of catastrophic violence. Before Bradley could formulate a response, the heavy wooden doors of Max swung open. The ambient noise in the pub, the clinking glasses, the murmuring conversations, the sports commentators on the television seemed to instantly evaporate. Walking through the door was Master Chief Thomas Carter. Carter was a living, breathing legend within the naval special warfare community. With over 2 decades of combat deployments, he possessed a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite and weathered by a sandstorm. He was a colossal man built like a brick wall and commanded a level of respect that bordered on absolute reverence. Carter took 3 steps into the pub, his eyes doing a rapid, tactical sweep of the room. He bypassed the bar entirely, his gaze locking onto the scene unfolding in the corner booth. He saw the large civilian leaning aggressively over the table, and he saw the slender woman holding the civilian's wrist in a death grip. Carter's heavy boots thumped against the floorboards as he marched directly toward them. Bradley, recognizing the Master Chief from around the base and eager to assert his dominance, tried to twist his wrist out of Riley's grip to greet the man. "Master Chief Carter," Wathy announced, forcing a strained, confident smile. "Good to see you. Just trying to teach this local girl a little respect for the heh. Shut your mouth, Carter snapped. His voice sounded like gravel grinding in a blender. He didn't even look at Bradley. His eyes were entirely fixed on Riley. Carter came to a dead stop at the edge of the table. To the absolute shock of every patron watching, the towering Master Chief squared his massive shoulders, stood rigidly straight, and gave a sharp, respectful nod that was a hair's breadth away from a formal salute. "Commander," Carter said, his voice ringing with profound respect. "Sir, I didn't know you were back stateside. The boys over at Team 3 said you were still forward deployed." Bradley froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. He stared at Carter, then slowly turned his head to look at the woman whose hand was still crushing his wrist. "Commander?" Riley released Bradley's arm with a look of mild disgust. She picked up her challenge coin and slipped it back into her jacket. "Just got back, Master Chief. Dropped into Nevada for some high-altitude work. Trying to enjoy a quiet drink before the debriefing." "Ah, I see," Carter said, finally shifting his terrifying gaze down to Bradley, who was currently rubbing his wrist and looking frantically between the two of them. "Is the civilian bothering you, Havoc?" Bradley stopped breathing entirely. Havoc? The name hit the defense contractor like a freight train. Even civilian contractors who only skirted the edges of the special warfare community had heard the whispered rumors. The ghost stories, the whispers of a female operator who had quietly, brutally navigated the grueling Bard-S pipeline, operating in the absolute shadows under a classified Tier 1 directive. They said she was a phantom in the mountains of the Shock Valley, a sniper who had broken the spirit of an entire insurgent cell in Helmand. Bradley had always assumed it was a myth, a piece of modern military folklore created to scare the rookies. "He was just leaving, Master Chief," Riley said quietly, picking up her bourbon. Bradley's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at the scarred hands, the cold, calculating eyes, the utterly unbothered demeanor of the woman he had just spent 5 minutes aggressively mocking. He had asked if she was waiting for a real man. He had accused her of trying to act tough. He had completely, terribly, tragically misjudged the apex predator sitting quietly in the corner. You heard the commander," Carter growled at Bradley, stepping forward so his massive chest was inches from Bradley's face. "Commander Riley Hayes, call sign Havoc. And if you ever disrespect a commissioned officer and a trident wearer in this establishment again, you won't need to worry about your company's contracts. You'll be worrying about how to drink your meals through a straw. Are we perfectly clear, son?" Bradley nodded frantically, unable to speak. He practically scrambled out of the booth, stumbling over his own tactical boots in his haste to escape the corner. He didn't look back at Todd and Greg. He didn't grab his expensive IPA from the table. He practically sprinted out the heavy wooden doors of McPee's, disappearing into the damp Coronado fog. Riley took another slow sip of her bourbon, the ice clinking softly against the glass. Carter chuckled deeply, sliding into the chair Bradley had just vacated. You know, Havoc," Carter smiled, signaling the bartender for 2 more drinks. "You really need to stop terrorizing the civilian contractors. It's bad for morale." Sight. Riley's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "I didn't say a word, Master Chief. I just prefer the quiet." The fog that rolled through Coronado that Tuesday night did little to cool Bradley Sterling's burning humiliation. He spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-anxious paranoia, jumping every time a military vehicle drove past his high-rise apartment in downtown San Diego. He had convinced himself that at any moment a team of enraged Navy SEALs was going to kick his door off its hinges. But as Wednesday turned into Thursday, the silence became its own kind of torture. No one came looking for him. The military machine kept churning, entirely indifferent to his bruised ego. By Friday morning, Bradley had managed to reconstruct the fragile walls of his arrogance. He stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the knot on his $300 silk tie, repeating a comforting mantra to himself. "She's just one officer," he rationalized, splashing cold water on his face. "Aegis Tactical Solutions is a massive defense contractor. My uncle owns the company. One little bar spat isn't going to derail a multi-million-dollar Department of Defense acquisition. She doesn't have that kind of pull." Bradley's uncle, Richard Sterling, was the CEO of Aegis, a man who viewed military contracts purely as numbers on a spreadsheet. For the past 18 months, Aegis had been aggressively developing a next-generation thermal optics system, the Argus X-1, designed specifically for maritime special operations. Today was the final hurdle, the critical evaluation brief at the Naval Amphibia Base. If the brass signed off, Aegis would secure a 10-year, $90 million supply contract. Bradley, as the lead project manager, was slated to deliver the presentation. "You ready for this, Brad?" Richard asked, clapping his nephew on the shoulder as they walked through the sterile, aggressively air-conditioned corridors of the base's administrative wing. Richard carried a locked Pelican case containing the prototype optic. "Born ready, Dick," Bradley lied, trying to suppress the nervous sweat accumulating at the base of his neck. "We have the best tech on the market. The frogmen are going to eat this up." They were escorted by a stern-faced master-at-arms into a windowless, soundproofed, rumor-sensitive compartmented information facility, or SIF. The air inside felt heavy, scrubbed clean by high-grade filters and humming with the low vibration of encrypted servers. A long mahogany conference table dominated the space, surrounded by heavy leather chairs. Sitting along the right side of the table were 4 naval officers in their green and tartan Type 3 Navy working uniforms. 3 of them were standard acquisitions officers, men with clipboards and tired eyes who spent their days reading technical manuals. But it was the person sitting at the head of the table that caused the blood to freeze in Bradley's veins. Commander Riley Hayes. She wasn't wearing a faded hoodie or a leather jacket today. She was in full uniform, the gold oak leaf of an 05 pinned sharply to her collar, the coveted special warfare trident gleaming above her left breast pocket. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back into a regulation, immaculate bun. Her posture was flawless, projecting an aura of absolute unyielding command. Sitting immediately to her right, arms crossed over his massive chest, was Master Chief Thomas Carter. When Bradley walked through the heavy SIF doors, his footsteps faltered. The color drained from his face so rapidly that his uncle Richard shot him a look of deep concern. Riley looked up from the dossier resting on the table. Her eyes cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of surprise locked onto Bradley. There was no smirk, there was no flash of recognition or vindictive triumph. She looked at him with the exact same clinical detachment she might use to evaluate a rusty hinge on a Humvee. "Gentlemen," Riley said, her voice carrying that same low, resonant authority that had chilled Bradley to the bone in McPease. "Take a seat. We have a tight schedule, and I am not inclined to waste the Navy's time. Let's see what Aegis has brought us." Bradley's mouth tasted like copper. He fumbled with his briefcase, dropping his laser pointer onto the carpeted floor. He scrambled to pick it up, his face flushing a violent, patchy red. Master Chief Carter let out a low, barely audible scoff that sounded like a diesel engine turning over. "Mr. Sterling," Richard whispered harshly, grabbing Bradley by the elbow and forcing him into his chair. "Pull it together." Bradley stood at the head of the room, plugging his laptop into the secure projector system. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely connect the HDMI cable. He looked at the slide on the screen, a flashy, marketing-heavy graphic of the Argus X-1 optic, and felt the crushing weight of impending doom. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that Riley Hayes wasn't just at the meeting. As the senior operator in the room, she was the sole deciding vote. "Whenever you're ready, Mr. Sterling," Riley said, clicking a matte black pen once. The sound echoed in the quiet room like a firing pin striking an empty chamber. "Right," Bradley croaked, clearing his throat aggressively. He forced his eyes away from Riley and stared at the back wall of the skiff. "Commanders, Master Chief, thank you for having us. Aegis Tactical Solutions is proud to present the Argus X-1. This is a leap forward in multi-spectrum thermal imaging. It features a 60 Hz refresh rate, a proprietary vanadium oxide microbolometer, and an integrated ballistic calculator. It is quite simply the most advanced optic ever proposed for the Tier 1 community." He clicked to the next slide, which showed a rendering of a SEAL utilizing the optic in a perfectly lit, sanitized urban environment. Bradley launched into his rehearsed pitch, leaning heavily on buzzwords and corporate jargon. He talked about synergy, force multipliers, and lethality maximization. For 10 minutes he managed to string the words together, desperately hoping the technical jargon would shield him from the intense, laser-focused scrutiny of the woman at the head of the table. Mr. Sterling, Riley interrupted. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through Bradley's corporate speak like a scalpel. Bradley froze mid-sentence. Yes, Commander? You've spent a lot of time discussing the microbolometer's sensitivity in a vacuum, Riley said, turning a page in her dossier without looking at him. Let's talk about environmental degradation. My teams operate in maritime environments. What is the battery degradation rate when this optic is submerged in 34-degree saltwater for a period of 4 hours, followed immediately by exposure to ambient desert temperatures exceeding 110 degrees? Bradley blinked. His Uncle Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Well, Commander, Bradley stammered, pulling at his collar, the unit is IP68 rated for water resistance. As for the thermal shock, our lab tests indicate a minimal drop in battery efficiency. Perhaps 5 to 8%. Lab tests, Riley repeated slowly, rolling the words around as if inspecting them for cracks. Master Chief, did the insurgents in Helmand Province adhere to lab conditions? Negative, Commander, Carter replied, a dark amusement dancing in his eyes. They were notoriously poor at following scientific protocols. Riley looked back at Bradley. I don't care about your lab, Mr. Sterling. I care about the surf zone. 3 weeks ago, my operators evaluated an early prototype of the similar casing design. When we transitioned from a submerged insertion in freezing water to a high-altitude climb, the internal battery housing cracked due to micro-contractions in the polymer. The optics died exactly when we crossed the shoreline. If that happens in a live fire scenario, my people are blind. She pulled a high-resolution photograph from her folder and slid it across the mahogany table. It showed the cracked, waterlogged remains of an optic remarkably similar to the Argus X1. Furthermore, Riley continued, her tone relentless, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. Your proprietary software relies on an automatic calibration algorithm to filter out thermal bloom. In a close-quarters environment, if a flashbang goes off in a confined space, how long does the Argus X1 take to reset its thermal baseline? The software resets in approximately 2 seconds, Bradley said, his voice shrinking to a whisper. 2 seconds, Riley said softly. The silence that followed was heavier than lead. She looked around the table at the other naval officers. Gentlemen, in close-quarters combat, 2 seconds is a lifetime. 2 seconds is the difference between clearing a room and sending a flag-draped coffin to Dover. Your system attempts to automate a process that requires manual override. You built a product that assumes the operator is incapable of making complex decisions under fire. Bradley felt as though the floor had completely dropped out from beneath him. He looked at his uncle, who was staring at the table, his face pale and tight with fury. The pitch was falling apart. Worship was being dismantled not by malice, but by sheer, unassailable competence. Riley wasn't attacking Bradley to get revenge for the bar. She was doing it because the equipment was flawed, and she refused to compromise the safety of her teams. You told me recently, Mr. Sterling, that the gear my operators are running is obsolete, Riley said, leaning back in her heavy leather chair. It was the only reference she made to their encounter at Bikmis, but it landed with the force of a kinetic strike. The optic we currently run is heavier, yes. It has a lower refresh rate, but it is entirely mechanical. It doesn't rely on predictive algorithms that fail when a flashbang detonates, and its battery housing is forged from milled aluminum, not injection-molded polymer. It works in the ice. It works in the sand. It works because it has to. She closed her dossier with a definitive snap. The Naval Special Warfare Development Group will not be moving forward with the Argus X1, Riley stated, her final verdict ringing through the SCIF. Your technology is impressive for a recreational hunting application, Mr. Sterling, but it has absolutely no place in a Tier 1 combat deployment. This briefing is concluded. Riley stood up. Master Chief Carter and the other officers instantly rose to their feet. She gathered her files, her face an unreadable mask of absolute professionalism, and walked toward the exit. As she passed Bradley, who was currently gripping the edges of the podium to keep his knees from buckling, she paused for a fraction of a second. She didn't look at him. She didn't gloat. Have a good day, Bradley, she murmured, a voice identical to the polite dismissal she had given him in the pub just days prior. The heavy door of the SIF ticked shut behind her, leaving Bradley standing in the deafening silence of his ruined career. He had mistaken her quiet demeanor for weakness, her solitude for vulnerability. He had tried to play the alpha in a room where he didn't even rank on the food chain. He had mocked a phantom, and the phantom had calmly, professionally, and entirely destroyed him. True leadership and lethal competence never need to shout to be heard. They prove themselves when the pressure is highest. Commander Hayes didn't just humble a bully, she protected her team with undeniable expertise, showing that the quietest professionals are always the most dangerous. If you loved the story of real-world justice and tactical brilliance, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe.